Michelle?
Daniel, OG Rose. Another night, kids are asleep, and we're going to be talking about the word dialectic because it's a word people throw around and it's kind of confusing. And the title of the piece is going to be Hegelian Dialectics are not discussion dialectics, because part of the problem is people use the term dialectic to mean just a discussion between opposing views.
Yes.
You know, you have that idea out there that is attributed to Hegel of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. But as we're arguing this work, that's not found in Hegel. That's a misunderstanding of Hegel. It's something that's been attributed to him, which is very problematic because Hegelian dialectics are more of a constant tension that you learn to live with, that you manage. There is no final resting place. There is no resolution. There is no completion, no final unity, as Cadell Last mentions. And this whole talk will be deeply indebted to the work of Cadell Last on Hegel. I would be very surprised if there's a better reader of Hegel out there than Dr. Last. But anyway, it's very important to get the difference between dialectic, but if we think that all dialectics are resolvable, then this Hegelian understanding of dialectics will not even be a category in our thinking. And if the limits of our language are the limits of our world, as Wittgenstein put it, then we will be greatly impoverished. And if we encounter situations that cannot be resolved, we won't have a category to understand it. So we're trying to draw out a distinction between Hegelian dialectics, which are unresolvable, but just because they're unresolvable does not mean you can't have progress. That's a big mistake that I think people make, and we're making a distinction between Hegelian dialectics and discussion dialectic.
Yeah, well, I think it's funny because it sounds like Hegel's been misread.
That Harold Bloom is probably, he passed recently, but he's like, yep, all of history is one giant misreading. All of literary and philosophical thinking is one giant, long misreading.
Right, and it's almost, because it's, well, let's just get back to the discussions that can be resolved.
Right.
So I think in a way, that's why it's almost like, well, he couldn't possibly mean, having this open tension. So he must have meant synthesis, right?
Yeah.
And that's because it is hard for humans to live in the tension space.
Oh yeah.
And it's not comfortable for most people because it's a natural desire to want unity.
Oh yeah. Complete unity.
Right. But I was kind of thinking about it while I was reading the paper. Even in marriage, if we think about like the ultimate unity, like even in sexuality, it's not like a constant. You know what I mean?
Sure.
It's the fabric of it is more, as the paper will get into, this idea of shoulder to shoulder.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think that's an important realization. Though there's something very beautiful in the unity, and it is something that kind of weaves together to make the shoulder to shoulder meaningful in really important ways. But the point is that we have to kind of realize that actually the majority of the time in our relationships there's going to be much more of the shoulder to shoulder.
Oh, yeah.
Of like basically this understanding that the unity is not necessarily found in the the manifestations of our ideas. It's almost like we have a commonality that we will be different. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. For Hegel, the difference does not resolve into any kind of sameness or synchronicity. I think, like you brought up marriage, people have this idea that in marriage there's like a complete unity of mind, soul, and body in the sense of you're like twins, like identical twins, synchronized. And the thing is, if you expect that when it doesn't occur, then you'll think you're doing something wrong, that you married the wrong person, you'll get disillusioned, and that will have consequences. So, first off, again, all this talk on Hegel seems esoteric and like it doesn't matter, but it has very real practical consequences.
Yes.
Because if you don't understand that there is a type of dialectical relationship of differences that never resolves, if you don't have that category, then when you encounter that situation, you're going to think there's something wrong with you. And that's going to lead to disillusionment and different trouble and different problems. Also, too, for Hegel, just because you can't have complete unity doesn't mean the lines, the asymptote, these lines, they can't get closer and closer with time, with effort.
Yes.
You can work and get them closer and closer and closer. It's just that they never completely arrive.
Sure.
But it, again, just because you can't have total unity or doesn't mean you can't have progress. And in fact, by not having this Hegelian category of dialectic, then people even feel bad or like something's off to even admit that you don't have that total final
Yes.
unity. There's something taboo about saying that doesn't exist. So then everyone in their secret private life where they don't have that, think they're alone, think there's something wrong, and then they isolate themselves and the problems in the relationship get worse. But in fact, if you acknowledge in a relationship that you're working shoulder to shoulder, that you're never going to get the complete synchronicity, unity, maybe in heaven, but not on earth, well, then you know what you're working for, you adjust your expectations, and you live a more fulfilling life.
Yeah, I think too the term shoulder to shoulder sometimes gets like you're not looking in each other's eyes, or
Sure.
It's like, we're kind of like shoulder to shoulder in a sense, but we're talking, of course.
Yes,
and that's
of course.
the thing. It's like that's it's not. There's still something very collaborative, if you will, right?
Oh,
Or
absolutely.
you can have. I think that maybe harmony is a better word
Sure.
to seek after than synchronization.
Sure.
Now, like, especially in being an identical twin myself, I understand that the allure of the synchronicity, because it's a very enjoyable. There's just so much ease in that dynamic. Like with me and my twin sister, we're just very much on the same page. It's almost like you can just mind read,
Sure, absolutely.
And there's something just really, really quite special about that. The reality is, though, is that most people are not your identical twin sister. You know?
Right.
If you think about all the people in the world that one-on-one versus all those other people, it's an astronomical proportion of people that are not your twin sister, identical twin sister or brother.
Sure.
You have to learn. You have to learn how to really manage the difference.
Well, that phrase you just used, manage difference.
Yes,
You're not even going to think you need to manage difference if you think that absolute unity is possible.
Yes.
So you're not going to do the work to have the skills to manage difference. You're not going to do meta talks. Like we've mentioned, some of the subjects we've gone on. You're not going to try to figure out what is love versus like, all these different philosophical stuff, because you don't think you need to manage difference. You think difference vanishes. And when it doesn't, because you think there's something wrong with you, or you'll think you're doing something wrong in your marriage or your work or whatever, because you don't have a category of dialectic that never resolves. That is something you have to work with. As Dr. Lass discusses, from Freud, we have this idea, we have this subconscious desire to return to a primordial unity. Where the child is one with the mother, in the womb, sort of this primordial unity. And the idea that you get in some thinkers like Lacan is that we live our entire lives with a sense of a loss of that unity, that we're always trying to get back. Now, we never actually have that unity. It's always a feeling that we have, but you experience this sort of loss, and you go through life trying to look how to fill that loss, but you never can. What you can do is learn to manage that loss and to progress in a dialectical relationship with others and yourself. I mean, this is not just a dialectic between you and another. It can also be a dialectic between you and your idea of who you are and who you actually are. And learning to live with that tension of always not quite being what you think you are, and never fully understanding who you are, and always being veiled from yourself by cognitive biases, and just knowing that you can never close that gap. Well, if you only think of dialectics as eventual unities that resolve, then you'll think there's something wrong with you. You'll think that everyone else is unified in their consciousness, in their idea of self, and you alone aren't. So you'll think there's something wrong. You won't share it with other people. You won't talk about how you feel with other people because you'll think you're the black sheep, and you'll get isolated, and your neuroses will get worse and worse.
Yeah, I mean that's huge. Managing, versus resolving.
Right.
When it's probably too because we like to close the loop. We want
absolutely.
We just want it to be done. We want it to be finished. We want it to be, and it's just not that simple. It's not that way.
No.
And the thing is that to even be able to exist and have conversations at all, or dialectical, you have to be alive. Your heart is beating. It doesn't stop.
That's right.
So it's like, I think there's something very, very about the constant work, the constant managing that, we have to embrace.
Oh, yes.
Because it is the reality. It is the reality of our bodies. Our bodies are constantly doing these managing processes to keep ourselves alive biologically,
Oh, yeah, and it should be noted that what we're saying about there being dialectics of Hegelian dialectics, we'll call them, these eternal tensions that you're working with. the work of Lacan, Freud, or Zizek, all these different people try to provide ontological and psychoanalytical evidence that this is in fact the case, that these do exist. This is not just speculation. Now, arguably, these writers may sometimes struggle to make what they're saying clear, thus the value of someone like Dr. Last. But there's a long history of literature that has tried to articulate and trace out the nature of the real, to provide credence to the case that Hegelian dialectics. Well, ironically, the more important the entity, the more likely a Hegelian dialectic is the way to understand it, as opposed to a classical dialectic where resolution, like the self, the soul, the marriages, relationship, all of these things are better understood in terms of Hegelian dialectics as opposed to dialectics that can resolve. So the more emergent or arguably important the thing, the more we should approach it as a Hegelian, as opposed to, I suppose, a resolutionist. Someone looking for resolution.
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I was talking with a friend about this idea of how sometimes a lot of things that are discussed in general, in like mainstream media or social media, sometimes can be very political. So a lot of times it's like, oh, I'll avoid that because it's such a political topic or whatever. But it's interesting because it's a weird I don't know, I guess it's an irony where these are the very topics that are so important that they, like you're saying, they require more Hegelian dialectic happening. They require more of that dialectical conversation and existence, right? Because it needs to hold attention space. But the whole concept of politics is like somebody wins in the end, And so it's a hard thing because it's these are the topics that really should be given most time, most of the dialectical recognition of it being a Hegelian dialectic.
Absolutely. Well, to trace the point, the paper talks about the difference between discussion dialectic and Hegelian dialectic. And one of the problems is we think of all dialectics as discussions and that you'll come to a resolution. So, for example, the debate between freedom and privacy. If we think of it as a discussion dialectic, then you debate that we need freedom, I debate we need privacy, we duke it out, I show my evidence, and privacy won. That's it. All right, so privacy becomes the dominance forever, and we don't worry about freedom anymore. Or the other way around, freedom won. That's literally how we think about it. Like, there's going to be a final debate,
it's almost like a KO,
it's done. Freedom wins.
Out.
Privacy wins, or equality, equality of opportunity won as opposed to equality of outcome. That's how we think. Yeah. But democratic debates, they're Hegelian dialectics. In one situation, freedom should be stressed over privacy. In another circumstance, privacy should be stressed over freedom. Yes. And in another circumstance, 60% freedom and 40% privacy. The debate does not end. Yes. It's constantly shifting relative to the situation because the situations are live. And even if it's theoretically possible to end the debate relative to X topic, the debate itself cannot end because topic Y comes up tomorrow and topic Z or situation Z comes up tomorrow where you have to revisit the debate because new variables have come about. It's like we have with the freedom of speech. The freedom of speech debate, for example, could in a sense end before you had social media, but then social media comes along and it has to restart. So in a sense, it never ends. It just has, it's almost like in Hegel, perhaps you can have periods of rest, periods of rest, but you can never have resolution. And so it has to keep going. But generally we think of discussion dialectics as things where we get a resolution and we can get temporary resolutions. So that makes us think that all temporary rests, we should put it, that makes you think all dialectics can similarly do that. And so you look for it in yourself and you look for it in your marriages. And when you don't find it, well, you must think there's something wrong. And you're going to probably just blame the other person.
Well, I was going to say, I'm so glad you brought that up, Daniel. I'm just kidding. But I'm so glad you brought that up because I think that is so true. Yes, I think a lot of people can get inwardly like, oh, like maybe something's wrong with me. But a lot of times I think it's just, okay, that person is the problem.
Well, if you think dialectics are supposed to resolve and they're not, right, it must be the other person's fault.
Right.
It's got to be someone's fault. You're not going to blame yourself.
Well, yeah, it's just so funny because it's just we're just so hungry for it. We're so hungry for the resolution. So then when it doesn't happen, we just think that something's wrong instead of realizing that perhaps the fact that this is just something you must manage, that it will not have some endpoint resolution, means it's alive. It means you're, it means that this is actually, in a way, kind of how it's going to be. It's how it should be. I don't know how to put it. It's just, I think how it is. It's going to.
It's all about metaphors.
It's not necessarily a problem. It's like it might. I guess it might be if you start throwing punches at each other.
Sure.
But it's like if you're managing it, then it's like, oh, I don't know. I always go back to the garden.
Sure.
The garden imagery, but it's like you're tending your garden.
You can't solve a garden.
Yeah, you can't solve. There's no like, okay, no more weeds.
Yeah, wouldn't that be nice?
Okay, no more.
If I said to you that you have to work out to keep your health, you wouldn't say, well, I guess health doesn't exist. I mean, or health is broken or it's not worth it. Likewise, if I said relationships are things that you perpetually manage, you don't just get the right. It's almost like we think if we get the right elements together, if we get the right personality types, the right hobbies together, then the people, boom, you put them together and that's a happy marriage. You get the elements set at the start and it's good. Now, you could have all the right elements. You could have the most compatible people on planet Earth. And if they stop doing the work, it'll fall apart.
Yeah.
That's the main idea in Hegel. Hegel wants you to not stop doing the work. He wants you to keep working, to keep, striving, to keep moving forward.
Yeah.
And the idea in Hegel is that, no, you can't ever reach a state where you can stop doing the work.
Well, and I think that's so key too, because then, the good thing about this analogy of the shoulder to shoulder is like, I don't know, back to the gardening thing. It's like if you have your like hoe, your sharp tool, whatever you're using, and you're just like, let's say you're just like tilling up your soil. Well, that would really be dangerous if you're facing somebody.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's like you're kind of like you actually have to work your patch. You have to work you're not working at that person. You're working at your whatever you're doing.
Yes, that's
what
right.
are you making? What are you cultivating? What are you growing?
That's right.
And I think that the problem with seeing it as like the dialectic discussions, like where there can be resolution, this misinterpretation of what Hegel has said, is that you start making the project fixing the other person
inevitably, and
somehow like cultivating them. You can't do that. You that's another person. They're not your project. If anything, you can only control yourself. Work on yourself, work on your garden, and that's where I think this kind of orientation of this shoulder to shoulder helps a little bit too, because then when you're doing your work with your gardening tools, you're not digging into another person. You're not taking stabs at another person,
That's right.
You're digging into the soil where you're going to plant your seeds, or you're taking out your weeds, and you're thinning out your plants, or whatever you want to do.
Well, and the other key notion is if we understand that our self, our structure of consciousness, is a Hegelian dialectic in itself, then that means we ourselves are always working against our neuroses. There's kind of an idea that neuroses are...
Is that kind of like when I stuff the chocolate chips in the corner of the Is that my neuroses?
No, that's totally normal. Everyone does that. They hide the chocolate chips in the corner. But a neuroses would be like a need to control situations, or an anxiety every time your mother walks in the room. Like these different psychological hiccups that you have, that you maybe hide yourself, or that you manage a sense of control, understanding of the world, or hiding from yourself certain maybe traumas or repressions that you went through. So neuroses is a broad category, but generally what has happened is we think of neuroses as things that are rare. They are things that a few people have. They're not a thing that everyone has, and you can, treat them with a pill and then they go away. That's kind of a thought in the pharmaceutical industry. But the main idea is that neuroses are oddities. They're not normal. Yeah. If we take Hegel seriously, and this would go with Lacan and Freud, then neuroses are the norm. They're the thing that everyone has all the time, that they do everything in their power to hide from themselves, let alone other people. And if these neuroses are like a garden, they can come back anytime, that you can't ever completely get rid of them. Maybe you can put them to rest to the point where they don't ever come back, but they're always there in potential. Well, then there's always a work you need to be doing with yourself, and the correct way to think about that is a Hegelian dialectic. So if you've got that Hegelian dialectic in yourself, then you think of the Hegelian dialectic between you and the other, and that other has their own Hegelian dialectic going on. Exactly. Well, then there's space in your thinking for, they need to do their own work. As I do my own work in the garden, you do your patch and I do our patch. And then when we look up, we'll have the whole garden done.
Exactly.
Exactly. But The problem is, of course, if you think of yourself in terms of a resolvable dialectic, well, since your neuroses can't be resolved, you're going to have to be treating them poorly. You're going to have to be ignoring them or repressing them or not ever managing them. And that's what unfortunately ends up happening. Then people get married and they explode. They show up.
Yeah,
because you have so many mechanisms to hide them before you get married or before you get in a serious commitment, and then they show up. And since you don't have a metaphoric structure of a dialectic of management, yes. Hegelian dialectic, then you just think there's something wrong with you. You need to take pills, or the other person must be doing. You never acted this way until the other person showed up, so it must be the other person, and so you don't do the work on yourself. And if you don't do the work on yourself that we're so describing, well, my goodness, what are the chances of doing the work between you and the other person? Yeah. Like, if you don't see yourself in terms of a Hegelian dialectic, then you're not going to see your relation with the other as a Hegelian dialectic, or you probably won't, and it works both ways. So it tends to be, what's so bad is we tend to make the mistake of dialectics that can resolve all the way down, or we make the correct understanding of Hegelian dialectics all the way down, all the way up and down. We either almost get it totally wrong or totally right. We don't tend to fall into a middle zone.
Yeah. I mean, when you're talking about the neuroses, just are you saying that they're essentially like weeds, where like you pull them up, but they will come back?
Yeah, weeds come back.
But you just have to keep like.
You can put weed tarp down. You could spray. You could do things to keep them back. And sure, maybe there are some neuroses you can get rid of entirely. Maybe an alcohol addiction, which then the question, I might be, if I'm describing is addiction a neuroses. I mean that would get into the technicalities of the industry, of the field. But there are certainly that we don't want to say. The paper makes a point to say that we don't want to say that there are no resolvable differences, like at all. There are different, we can have disagreeing views about tax rates. We look at the evidence and say, well, it actually looks as if 30% is the best rate on the Laffer curve to maximize tax revenue relative to tax rates. Okay, resolution. You can have resolutions, discussion, different things. And there are very easily certain psychological problems, perhaps like an alcohol addiction, that you can overcome. But you can't get rid of all neuroses entirely, or get rid of the possibility of neuroses coming back. And so there must be a constant work. If you do a lot of hard work, like in the garden, if you take out a lot of weeds, then the next time you weed, it can be easier because there's not so many. But there does have to be a perpetual management, a perpetual revisiting, a perpetual rechecking, a perpetual making sure you're doing things in the right order so the problems don't come back.
And there's just something that has to be so careful about that too. How like some of the weeds. Some weeds are extraordinarily spiky.
Oh, it's crazy.
It's
I got one in my foot. It was unbelievable.
I know. I'm so sorry.
Bad.
I know that hurts
it's
so
like,
much.
What? Oh, it was awful. Yeah.
I'm so sorry. That
spike
happened.
Weeds.
It's insane. They're like from Bowser's Castle or something.
Yeah, no, that's exactly where they're from. That's exactly where they're from.
But it's like, I'll be out there with the kids and I'm like, I should really pull out that weed. Yeah. But it's literally covered in spikes.
It's very hard.
And I'm just like, I cannot pick that up with my bare hands.
That's right.
I need some
gloves.
Yeah,
you literally need gloves.
And it's just like, it's such a careful work, to
and in that sense, there are some neuroses that are more difficult to remove than others.
Sure.
They have layers of protection on them that you have to bring special forces in or special instruments.
Exactly. But it's like, even if you pull that up, it's still going to start growing again.
Yes.
And like you said, even if you overcome, like say your alcohol addiction, you're still going to have each day a choice to make, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
You get to make a choice not to, and you can have 30 years straight of making the choice not to. And it's almost like just getting, like you're saying, managing. When you do it more often too, you're just better at it.
You get easier. Well, this is why there's progress in Hegel.
You pick up on it much more quickly.
Yes, and
that's a weed versus this being the plant. You know what I mean?
You get better at it, and you don't let the weeds get terrible. It's like the first year we did a garden; it was special, and then you get better. Well, that's why there's progress in Hegel. That's the key idea: is you literally get better. Like there is progress in Hegel, in Hegelian dialectics.
But you're always still going to manage. You will
always have to manage. Mm-hmm. You progress in your ability to manage weeds, but you don't make weeds vanish. Like when you become an expert at weeding your garden, weeds don't cease to exist.
Exactly.
But there is a difference between someone who's bad at weeding a garden and someone who's good at it. There is a real difference. Likewise, there is a very real difference between a person that has gained the ability to manage their neuroses, to understand the difference between themselves and other, to live and be comfortable with that tension. There's a very real difference between that person and someone else who is still ascribing and living to dialectics of unity, the possibility of unity, who has never done that work, that when it turns out that is not possible, they fall apart. They don't know what to do.
Oh yeah, 100%. And I think that's so key. What the paper brings out about this idea of the Hegelian dialectic and how you're talking about it relating to the self, because it just really can't be understated that you do have a dialectical process with your own self.
Oh yeah, and Cadell is great on this in his lectures. We couldn't get into all that here, but the particular structures of the consciousness, all the self, in the philosophy of lack.
Check out his YouTube channel.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. It's truly extraordinary. But you were saying.
Yeah, just it's an important thing to identify, because like you're saying, if you don't really identify it there, you certainly won't identify it when it comes to speaking to the other.
No, no, not at all. Well, because it's just too easy to say they're wrong. It's just too easy to frame them as the problem.
Yeah.
And if you've never, it's hard to imagine if you haven't gone through a dialectical process with yourself, where you see your terms in dialectic. It's just hard to imagine pride not winning or self-deception not winning of yourself. You say, oh, sure, I had problems in the past, but I'm better now. It's hard not to ultimately position the ego. Your ego is being fixed. And if you just don't have a sense, no one is going to say they're perfect. Everyone will say they're imperfect. But there's a difference between saying you're imperfect, meaning there were problems I had in the past and now I've gotten over them, or, and I'm done, I'm resolved, as opposed to saying nobody's perfect, so it's a perpetual weeding every single day. And if you're not doing that, you're just going to fall into the temptation of framing the other as the problem, and putting all your psychic cognitive energy toward fixing them as opposed to fixing yourself.
Yeah, well that was great. Thank you for talking about the Hegelian dialectic.
Yeah, and I mean the last thing I'll say is, if we think of all this dialectics as discussion, since it's possible for discussions to unify, then we'll also think it's possible for the self to unify and therefore the other to unify. You work backwards from that discussion dialectic, and it creates all sorts of problems.
Yeah, so it seems like the unity is not some sort of this merged, blurry merged.
Right.
It's like a dance. It's always going to be like this dance between the two.
Well, that's where the C.S. Lewis space trilogy image, where he talks about the Trinity as being a dance, where they're dancing. They're not merged into a blob, but they're always dancing. But anyway, that's the difference between Hegelian dialectics and other understandings of dialectics. For more, please visit ogrose.com, and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, guys. Bye-bye.